Story 1. Eerie House Purchase. I was a 42-year-old literature professor when my life fell apart. After a bitter divorce that left me with little more than my books and a desperate need for change, I moved to the city, looking for a fresh start. My budget was tight and academic salary doesn't go far, but I wasn't picky. When I found the listing for a small one-bedroom apartment in a crumbling building on the city's outskirts, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The price was absurdly low, almost suspiciously so, but the landlord assured me it was simply due to the building's need for a little TLC. The day I moved in, the building had an oppressive air. It wasn't just the peeling paint or the smell of mildew. It felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. My unit was on the 4th floor, and as I climbed the creaking stairs with a box in my arms, I noticed how quiet it was. I hadn't passed a single tenant, and the corridors seemed almost abandoned. When I finally made it to my door, the key turned with a grating metallic click, and the air inside smelled stale, like no one had lived there for years. By the time I unpacked, the sun was setting, casting an amber glow through the lone, grimy window in the living room. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to grab some dinner. The streets were as dilapidated as the building-broken streetlights, overgrown weeds, and graffiti-covered walls. A man in a torn hoodie sitting on a stoop gave me a long, unreadable look as I passed. When I nodded in greeting, he muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "Watch yourself." Back at the apartment, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. I tried to chalk it up to nerves. Starting over in a new place wasn't easy. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a specific sound or sight, just an unshakable sense of being watched. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette seemed unusually loud, filling the silence like a growling beast. The next morning, I woke up groggy and disoriented. I hadn't slept while every creak of the old wooden floors had sounded like footsteps. I tried to laugh it off as paranoia, but when I stepped into the hallway to head to work, I noticed something unsettling. A small bundle of dried herbs, tied with a piece of frayed red string, was sitting outside my door. It wasn't there the night before. I bent down to inspect it, and the scent sharp and earthy hit me. A woman's voice startled me. "Don't touch that," she said sharply. I turned to see an older woman peeking out from her door across the hall. Her eyes were intense, sunken deep into her wrinkled face. Before I could respond, she continued, "Just leave it. It's for protection." Then, without another word, she closed her door with a soft click. Work that day felt like a blur. Between lectures and grading papers, I couldn't stop thinking about that bundle. Protection. Protection from what? When I returned home, it was still there, undisturbed. I stepped over it and went inside. The air in the apartment felt colder than before, and the faint smell of dampness lingered. I tried to settle in for the night, but something about the silence outside the apartment was unnerving. This was supposed to be a city, yet the streets seemed completely dead after dark. I didn't hear any cars, voices, or distant music, just the occasional creak of the building and the faint hum of my radiator. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, but when I leaned closer to the wall, it stopped. Things escalated on the third night. I was brushing my teeth when the light in the bathroom flickered. At first, I assumed it was the old wiring, but then the flickering seemed deliberate, pulsing, almost rhythmic. A chill ran down my spine. I hurried to finish and turned off the bathroom light, hoping to shake off the unease. That's when I heard it. A distinct knock, soft but deliberate, on the living room window. I froze. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and there was no fire escape outside that window. Slowly, I walked into the living room. The window was shut, the blinds half drawn, but the faint outline of a handprint was visible on the glass. My stomach churned. The print was too large to be mine, and too fresh to have been there when I moved in. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the window, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank a neighborhood kid with a ladder butt. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. By morning, the handprint was gone, leaving no smudge or streak behind. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I decided not to mention it to anyone. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. The next day, I ran into the old woman from across the hall while checking my mailbox. She gave me a piercing look, her face set in a grim expression. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked abruptly. Her tone sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, but my voice faltered. She shook her head and muttered something in a language I didn't recognize. Then, louder, she said, "You should leave while you can. That place, it doesn't forget." Before I could ask her what she meant, she shuffled away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. That evening, I tried to research the building, hoping to uncover something that would explain the strange occurrences. I found almost nothing, no reviews, no history, just the same sparse listing I'd seen before. Frustrated, I scrolled through city archives until I found something chilling. A news article from 10 years ago mentioned a string of violent crimes in the area, including a double homicide in my very building. The victims had been found in an apartment on the 4th floor. My stomach twisted when I read the number. It was my unit. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront the landlord. I called him, but the number went straight to voicemail. Undeterred, I visited his office the next day, only to find a vacant storefront. The only clue was a faded sign in the window that said, "For lease." It was as if he'd vanished. That night, I heard the knocking again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It came not just from the window, but from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. I felt surrounded, trapped. Then, faintly, I heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper. "Get out." My blood ran cold. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was in the apartment with me. I grabbed my phone and bolted out the door. In my panic, I found myself banging on the old woman's door. She opened it just a crack, her face pale and drawn. "I warned you," she said, her voice trembling. "It won't let you go so easily now." I spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too terrified to go back to the apartment. My mind raced with possibilities, ghosts, demons, maybe some kind of psychotic break, but none of it made sense. The next morning, I returned to the building, hoping to retrieve some of my belongings. The hallway was eerily quiet, and the bundle of herbs outside my door was gone. The apartment itself felt different, colder, as if the walls had absorbed the chill of the night. Determined to find answers, I began searching the apartment for anything unusual. In the corner of the bedroom, I noticed a loose floorboard. My hands shook as I pried it open, revealing a small, dusty box hidden underneath. Inside were photographs, grainy Polaroids, of people I didn't recognize. Each one had the same setting, the living room of my apartment. The faces were blurred, but their expressions were unmistakable: fear, confusion, and in some, outright terror. Beneath the photos was a handwritten note that read, "It watches, it waits." I stumbled back, clutching the note, when I heard the door creak open behind me. My heart nearly stopped, but no one was there. The air felt oppressive, and a low humming sound began to fill the room. I grabbed the box and ran out, leaving the door wide open. In my rush, I almost collided with the old woman in the hallway. She took one look at the box in my hands, and her face fell. "You shouldn't have touched it," she said gravely. "You've woken it." I couldn't stay in that building any longer. I packed whatever I could fit into a suitcase and left that same day. But even after moving to a new apartment across town, the sense of being watched never left me. At night, I would hear faint whispers, and once, I swore I saw a handprint on my window, the same as before. The box remains hidden in a storage unit, locked away where I hope it will stay forgotten. Sometimes I think about burning it, but a part of me is terrified of what might happen if I do. The old woman's warning still haunts me. It doesn't forget. Story 2. Found Camcorder Mystery. A few years ago, I was working as a junior architect for a small firm. We were handling the renovation of an old apartment building in the heart of the city, a job that should have been routine. The place was a pre-war structure, with high ceilings, ornate molding, and the kind of charm that people pay a fortune for these days. On the surface, it looked like a dream project, but something about the building felt wrong. It was hard to put my finger on, but the air inside felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the walls were holding on to something they didn't want to let go. The day I found the camera started out like any other. I was working alone in one of the apartments, tearing out a section of drywall that had been water damaged. The walls were stubborn, refusing to give way easily, and as I pried off a particularly stubborn piece, I saw something wedged in the gap between the studs. At first I thought it was trash, a bundle of wires, or an old tool left behind during a previous renovation, but when I pulled it out, I realized it was a small digital camcorder, wrapped in layers of dusty plastic. It was an older model, scratched and scuffed, but surprisingly intact. The plastic had kept it dry. And when I turned it over in my hands, I noticed a piece of masking tape on the back, with the words, "Do not delete," scrawled in black marker. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see if it still worked. I found an outlet nearby, plugged it in with an old cable I had in my toolkit, and to my surprise, the screen flickered to life. There were only 3 videos saved on the memory card. The first was dated 5 years ago, the second was just 2 days later, and the third was dated the day before I found the camera. I opened the first video, and the grainy footage filled the small screen. The camera was pointed at a man sitting in the very apartment I was working in, though it looked far less dilapidated in the video. The man was in his late 30s, with unkempt hair and dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. His voice was shaky as he began to speak. "If you're watching this," he said, glancing over his shoulder as though someone or something was behind him, "then I guess I didn't make it." He went on to explain that he had moved into the apartment a few months earlier, attracted by its low rent and central location. At first, everything had been fine, but then he began noticing strange things, objects, moving on their own. Cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and, worst of all, a sense of being watched. "It started small," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keys disappearing, lights flickering, but then it got worse, much worse." The video cut to black abruptly, leaving me unsettled. I played the second video, and this time, the man looked more disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and stained, his hair sticking up as if he hadn't combed it in days. "I've tried everything," he said, his voice hoarse. "Salt, sage, even a priest. Nothing works. It's still here." He turned the camera toward the hallway behind him, where a shadow seemed to dart just out of frame. He spun the camera back to his face, his eyes wide and panicked. "If you're in this place, get out. Leave. Don't make the same mistake I did." By now, my hands were trembling. I debated whether to watch the third video, the one dated just a day before. Part of me wanted to stop, to toss the camera, and never think about it again. But my curiosity and a creeping sense of obligation won out. I clicked play, and the screen filled with static for a moment before the image came into focus. The man wasn't in this one. Instead, the camera was set on a table, facing the living room, the same spot where I had found it. The room was dark, illuminated only by a faint streetlight outside. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of the frame, something moved. It wasn't the man, or anyone human. It was a shape, tall and angular, with impossibly long limbs. It moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching as it stepped into view. The figure lingered in the center of the frame, its head tilting unnaturally, as if it were studying the camera or, worse, whoever might be watching the footage. Its limbs twitched in jerky, unsettling movements, almost like it was glitching. I felt frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The creature's form was impossible to fully comprehend, its edges blurred as though it didn't belong in this world. And it stopped and turned toward the hallway, the same hallway I had just walked through earlier that day. The video cut out again, but not too black this time. The screen was filled with static, and faint whispers began to bleed through the speakers. At first, it sounded like gibberish, but as I leaned closer, I could make out words. "Not alone, always watching, leave." The static grew louder, the whispers blending into a crescendo of noise, until it abruptly stopped. The screen went black, leaving only my pale, terrified reflection staring back at me. I snapped the camera shut, my hands shaking. For a long time, I sat there in silence. The only sound, the faint hum of the building's ancient pipes. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to get as far from that apartment as possible. But as I looked around, I realized something terrifying. The shadows in the room didn't seem to match the light source. They stretched unnaturally, pooling in corners where they shouldn't have been. Grabbing the camera, I rushed out of the apartment and down the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty building. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. The camera felt heavy in my lap, as though it carried the weight of everything I had just witnessed. I decided to take it home, a choice I still regret. That night, I locked all my doors and tried to distract myself with television, but the unease followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and at one point, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of my window. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Or so I thought. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from my closet. The sound sent chills down my spine. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached, my heart hammering in my chest. When I swung the door open, the closet was empty, but on the floor was a fresh Polaroid photograph. It showed my living room, taken from the perspective of someone standing in the corner. I stared at the Polaroid, my mind racing. The photo was impossible. No one had been in my apartment. My hands shook as I turned it over, and my stomach dropped when I saw what was written on the back in shaky black letters. Keep watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak and groan of the apartment sent waves of paranoia through me. I sat on my couch with the camera on the table in front of me. Its lens pointed directly at me, as though daring me to turn it on again. The next day, I decided to bring the camera to a friend of mine, Alan, who was a tech-savvy conspiracy theorist. If anyone could make sense of what was going on, it was him. I explained everything, from finding the camera, to the videos, and the Polaroid. Alan listened intently, his usual smirk replaced with a rare seriousness. "This is messed up," he said finally, turning the camera over in his hands. "Whatever this is, it's not normal. You said the last video was dated the day before you found it." I nodded, my mouth dry. Alan plugged the camera into his computer, determined to extract more information. As he scrolled through the files, he paused. "There's something here. A file that doesn't show up on the camera itself." He clicked it open, and what appeared was a series of distorted images, each one more unsettling than the last. Faces with blank eyes, elongated limbs, and shadowy figures that seemed to writhe and shift as though they were alive. The final image froze us both. It was a picture of me, taken the moment I had found the camera in the wall. I wanted to scream, to throw the camera and run, but Alan stopped me. "Wait," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. "If this thing can see you, maybe it can be stopped." He began searching for metadata, timestamps, anything that could lead to an explanation. But as he worked, the room grew colder. The lights flickered, and the computer screen began to glitch. "This isn't good," Alan muttered, his fingers moving frantically over the keyboard. Then we heard a loud, deliberate knock on the door. Alan froze, his eyes darting to me. "Were you expecting someone?" he whispered. I shook my head, my heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of the doorknob jiggling. Alan grabbed a wrench from his desk, and I armed myself with the closest thing I could find, a heavy paperweight. Together, we approached the door, but when we opened it, the hallway was empty. Alan decided to keep the camera overnight, to dig deeper, though I could tell he was as unnerved as I was. I went home, still jumpy, and locked every door and window. I thought I'd feel safer without the camera, but the unease followed me. That night, I woke to a chilling sight. On my bedroom wall, scrawled in what looked like black ash, were the words, "You can't hide." The message on the wall left me frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I didn't hear anyone enter the apartment, and the windows were still locked. The ash-like letters seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight, filtering through the blinds, as though mocking my panic. I grabbed a damp cloth and scrubbed furiously until the words disappeared. But even as I worked, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. The next morning, I called Alan, desperate for answers. He picked up on the third ring, his voice tight. "You need to come over now." He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. By the time I arrived at his place, he looked worse than I'd ever seen him, pale, with dark circles under his eyes and his hands trembling slightly. "I found something," he said, leading me into his cluttered living room. The camera was on the coffee table, connected to his laptop. The screen displayed a video I hadn't seen before. "This wasn't here yesterday," Alan said, his voice low. "It appeared overnight, like it uploaded itself." He clicked play, and the screen filled with static before the same shadowy figure from the previous footage appeared. It moved closer to the camera, its jerky, unnatural movements even more pronounced. Then, to my horror, it spoke. The voice was deep and distorted, but the words were clear. "You belong to us now." Alan paused the video, his face grim. "This thing isn't just watching you, it's claiming you." He gestured to a notepad filled with scribbled notes and diagrams. "I think the camera is some kind of conduit, like a beacon that connects whatever this is to our world. And now that you've interacted with it, it's attached to you." I felt sick to my stomach. "So what do we do? Destroy it?" "I don't think that's an option," Alan said. "If this thing is tethered to the camera, breaking it might make things worse. We need to figure out where it came from, why it's here. Maybe then we can sever the connection." Reluctantly, we decided to return to the apartment where I found the camera, hoping to uncover more clues. The building was even more foreboding than I remembered. The air felt colder, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creaking of the old structure. As we entered the apartment, the atmosphere seemed to shift, like the space itself was alive and aware of our presence. Alan began examining the walls, looking for any hidden compartments or signs of tampering. Meanwhile, I noticed something odd. The shadows on the floor seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, just a flicker, but enough to make my heart race. I turned to Alan to warn him, but before I could speak, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into alternating moments of darkness and blinding brightness. A low, guttural growl filled the air, coming from all directions at once. Alan shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony. In the chaos, the camera, still in his hands, began to emit a faint glow, its lens fixated on the far corner of the room. When the light stabilized, we saw it. The figure stood there, its elongated form towering over us, its eyeless face turned toward the camera. It raised a hand, long fingers curling unnaturally, and pointed directly at me. The growl grew louder, almost unbearable, as if the building itself was screaming. The figure's growl seemed to shake the very foundation of the apartment. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Alan, however, acted fast. He aimed the camera directly at the figure, his finger hovering over the record button. "It's tied to this thing, right?" he shouted over the deafening noise. Without waiting for an answer, he pressed record. The effect was immediate. The figure jerked violently, its form glitching like a corrupted video file. The room filled with an ear-piercing screech as the figure began to collapse in on itself, dragged toward the camera lens as though being sucked into it. The walls of the apartment groaned, and cracks snaked across the ceiling. I grabbed Alan's arm and screamed, "We need to get out of here." Dragging the still recording camera with us, we bolted for the door. The air grew thicker with every step, like we were wading through molasses. Just as we reached the hallway, the building gave one final, bone-rattling shudder, and the door to the apartment slammed shut behind us. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a faint click from the camera broke the stillness. Alan and I looked down at the screen. The video had stopped recording, and the screen displayed a single message in bold, blocky text. "Connection terminated." Below, it was a date and timestamp 1 minute in the future. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. Before Alan could answer, the screen flickered one last time and went black. The camera shut itself off, and no amount of button pressing could bring it back to life. We left the building without looking back, neither of us willing to stay a second longer. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. Alan stopped returning my calls, and when I went to his apartment to check on him, it was empty. His landlord claimed he had moved out without notice, leaving behind nothing but a scribbled note on the counter. "Burn it." I haven't seen or heard from him since. The camera, lifeless and inert, sits in a box in my closet, hidden under piles of old clothes. I can't bring myself to throw it away or destroy it, fearing what might happen if I do. Some nights, when the house is quiet, I think I hear faint whispers coming from the closet. I tell myself it's my imagination, but deep down, I know better. If you ever come across something strange, a camera, a box, anything that feels wrong, leave it alone. Curiosity may uncover answers, but some questions are better left unasked. Story 3. Found USB mystery. I was in my final year of university, juggling late-night study sessions and my part-time job at the campus library. It wasn't glamorous, but the quiet shifts gave me time to focus on my assignments. One chilly evening, while shelving books in one of the lesser-used sections, I found something unexpected. Wedged between two dusty philosophy textbooks was a USB flash drive. It was a simple black stick, scratched and worn, with no identifying marks except a faint label in faded white text. Help. Curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching and pocketed the drive, planning to check it out later. When my shift ended, I headed straight to my dorm room. Plugging it into my laptop, I half expected it to be empty or full of old essays someone had forgotten. Instead, there was only one folder, labeled "Don't Open." My heart raced as I clicked on it, revealing a series of video files, each titled with a date. The earliest was from 3 years ago, the latest from just 2 weeks prior. I started with the oldest video. The screen flickered, and a man's face appeared. He was in his 40s, with graying hair and a haggard expression. The background looked familiar. One of the classrooms on campus. His voice was shaky as he spoke directly to the camera. "If you're watching this, please listen carefully. There's something on this campus. Something that doesn't belong here." He paused, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "It's been following me. And if you're watching this, it might be following you now too." I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I watched the man on the screen. His eyes darted nervously, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I first noticed it in the library," he said. "At first, I thought it was just shadows. But then, it started getting closer." He turned the camera toward a classroom door behind him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Slow and deliberate. He whipped the camera back around, his face pale. "I don't know what it is, but it knows when you notice it." I paused the video, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to stop, to unplug the USB, and forget the whole thing. But the man's fear felt real, and a morbid curiosity kept me going. I clicked on the next video, dated a week after the first. This time, the man looked even worse, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. He was in what looked like his office, surrounded by stacks of papers and books. "It doesn't like being ignored," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought if I stopped looking for it, stopped thinking about it, it would go away. But it won't." In the background, something moved, shadow shifting across the wall. The man didn't seem to notice, but I did. My breath caught as the shadow grew darker, more defined. It was humanoid but wrung its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. The man flinched suddenly, his eyes snapping to the camera. "If you're seeing this," he said, leaning closer, "stay out of the south wing of the library. That's where it." The video cut off abruptly. I sat back, my mind racing. The south wing was an area I walked through every day on my way to the archive room. I hadn't noticed anything strange before, but now, I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. Against my better judgment, I clicked on the third video. The third video began with a man pacing nervously in a dimly lit hallway. His face glistened with sweat, and his breathing was ragged. "I don't think I have much time left," he said. His voice strained. "It's always there now. Always watching." He pointed the camera toward a nearby window. For a moment, the screen was filled with darkness. But then something moved, just a faint blur at first, but it became clearer as it approached. It was the same figure from the previous video. Its unnaturally long limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. The man pulled the camera back to his face, tears welling in his eyes. "I don't know what it wants. It doesn't speak. It doesn't chase. It just waits. But it's not going to let me go." He leaned closer, his face filling the frame. "If you're watching this, I'm sorry. I think it's tied to this USB. Destroy it. Don't let it spread." The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the screen in stunned silence. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. Destroy it. That felt too simple, too final. What if there was more to the story? What if this man was still out there, needing help? Against every instinct telling me to stop, I opened the final video. The date on the file was from 2 weeks ago, but the setting was entirely different. The man wasn't in it this time. Instead, the camera was placed on the floor, pointed at the ceiling of what looked like a storage room. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then, from the edge of the frame, a hand reached out, pale and thin, its fingers impossibly long. It hovered there for a moment before pulling back into the shadows. I yanked the USB out of my laptop, my heart racing. I felt like I was being watched, even though I was alone in my room. The air felt heavier, colder, as though something had seeped out of the videos and into the space around me. I locked the USB in my desk drawer and spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that it was all just an elaborate prank. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My dorm room felt off, like the air was too still, the shadows too deep. I decided to follow the man's warning and avoid the south wing of the library. But the urge to understand what was happening wouldn't leave me. During my shift that evening, I tried to focus on shelving books, but my mind kept drifting back to the USB. Who was that man? Was he still alive? And, most importantly, what had I invited into my life by watching those videos? Around midnight, when the library was nearly empty, I heard something. It was faint at first, like the sound of distant footsteps. I froze, straining to hear over the hum of the fluorescent lights. The sound grew louder, deliberate, each step echoing through the silent stacks. I turned toward the source, my stomach twisting into knots. The footsteps were coming from the south wing. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my phone and began recording as I crept toward the forbidden section. The air grew colder with every step, and an oppressive silence settled around me, as though the library itself was holding its breath. When I reached the entrance to the south wing, I stopped. The lights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that danced across the walls. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, the figure stood motionless. Its elongated limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, blending into the darkness. Its eyeless face tilted in my direction, and though it didn't move, I felt its gaze pierce through me. My legs refused to move, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, in a jerky, unnatural motion, it raised one arm and pointed directly at me. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone as I fled from the south wing. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air burning my lungs. My phone vibrated in my hand, startling me. A notification popped up. New video saved to my gallery. Confused and terrified, I opened it. The footage was shaky, but unmistakable. It showed me running out of the library. And behind me, the figure followed, its limbs stretching as it glided silently through the stacks. I didn't go back to the library after that. I dropped out of school a month later, unable to shake the paranoia that followed me everywhere. The USB drive. I threw it into a dumpster in another city, but deep down, I know that wasn't the end. Some nights I wake to the sound of footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. I don't dare look. I just hope that when it finally catches up to me, I won't have to face it alone.